Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with an interesting topic, I think. Why is the great tradition of Brahms playing or performance dying in the orchestral sphere? Not, interestingly, in the chamber music sphere, which is a whole other topic. I find it really fascinating because, recently you asked me to start doing a series of great recent recordings of classic repertoire, the basics, and some other things too I can throw in. But I mean, essentially what you want to know is that you can get a discography of all the great stuff recorded since the year 2000, which is, our arbitrary line of demarcation. And Brahms is a very, very interesting case. There is great Brahms since the year 2000, and I talk about it, and I will continue to talk about it just to show how it works. But it's harder to come by, and it's getting harder to come by all the time. In fact, when I did my video about cocaine hippos, that is, worthless recordings of things that get made just because they can, not because they should, the iconic exemplar of that were two Brahms cycles in which the spurious nonsense being spouted by the period instrument people was applied to chamber music-y recordings of Brahms symphonies with absolutely vile and repellent results. Well, that's becoming ever more common. And the reason it's becoming ever more common is partly historical, partly aesthetic. It's a combination of factors. But the most interesting one is the historical factor because, Brahms symphonies were composed from the 1860s to the 1880s over roughly a 20-year period, and they immediately entered the repertoire. Or within a couple of decades, they had become standard repertoire, at least every place where there was a symphony orchestra. And as a result of that, the conductors who were associated with Brahms, who were the original performers of this repertoire, were, well, some of them were the older generation, the generation of like Mahler and those people. Well, they sort of died out and they weren't so quick to pick up Brahms. But the next group, the slightly younger group, Weingartner, Walter, Klemperer, Toscanini, who was practically a contemporary of Mahler, Furtwängler, Abendroth, the list goes on and on, Kleiber, Monteux, Sell, who was born in the 1890s, Reiner, they of course immediately picked up Brahms, and he became the modern German symphonist. Really one of the last. Bruckner, remember, is a more recent phenomenon. He was a local hero in certain strange, creaky German outposts, like Vienna, for example, until very, very recently. So Brahms was the guy, and everybody played him. And everybody played him pretty well within a certain style or tradition of performance. And that was what you might call the first generation, the first great generation of Brahms interpreters. And they lived to make, a lot of them lived to make very good sounding mono and stereo LP recordings of their Brahms cycles. I mean, Bruno Walter did, Toscanini made wonderful Brahms recordings. Furtwängler did a couple, and, just the list goes on and on and on. Joachim, I mean, my goodness. So we have fantastic Brahms performances by people who were directly associated with what we might call the, I have to say correct, but idiomatic style of Brahms interpretation. And lots of them, just lots and lots and lots of them. And they were succeeded by, they trained the next generation of conductors who also were pretty damn good at doing Brahms. I think Günter Wand and James Levine and Christoph von Dohnanyi, and you get the next generation who also benefited from the rising orchestral standards, because Brahms is a very difficult composer to play well orchestrally. His demands are all of a essential musical nature, and he doesn't make it easy. If you're a Brahms pianist, he doesn't make it easy for pianists either. He deliberately chooses options which are awkward in order to give his music a sense of strain or tension. And that has to be sustained while at the same time you have to surmount the difficulties. You have to have transparency. You have to have rhythm. You have to have really good intonation. You have to have balance. I mean, balance, because his orchestration is always weighted toward the strings and away from the winds and the brass. And you have to, is really, really tricky to do well. And so, and everybody likes it. And he only wrote 4 symphonies, and everybody plays it, and people expect that everybody's going to know it. And so it's very easy to get lazy with Brahms, number one. And it's also very easy to feel at this point, where everyone has done a million Brahms cycles. I mean, they're just all over the place. With all the great conductors of the past have made a statement in his music, even if they haven't done complete symphony cycles. You want to do something different, for its own sake. That's one aspect of the tension that leads us away, not so much from great Brahms, because there are always alternatives, but that idiomatic style of Brahms playing that orchestras were trained in and that conductors knew how to project, that's all going away because there's just pressure to do different things. And then add to that our current anti-romantic aesthetic, which is, it's a zeitgeist. It's a feeling that, that wonderful, yummy, warm with portamento and sentiment and all those things is like yucky and icky and wrong. You hear it most in the inability of so many of today's conductors to play convincing Tchaikovsky, where the emotionalism is so much more on the surface than it is with Brahms. But Brahms was no less passionate or romantic, not at all, not a bit. And so his music requires a lot of similar skills if you exercise them with perhaps a bit more discretion. And that too has fallen by the wayside. We're in a period of severity and scholarly austerity and classicism, if you want to call it. And of course, the spearhead of that is the period instrument movement, which is entirely speculative in terms of its sonic predilections, but which is selling itself as authenticity and truth and justice and moral absolutism and sanctification and all of that crap. And people have sucked it up. They've drunk the Kool-Aid. Performers have drunk the Kool-Aid particularly. And so we see now these Brahms cycles done by little chamber orchestras according to, period instrument thingies, when the people who were actually there and who knew Brahms and who knew what to do correctly and who knew what he wanted or would have wanted had he lived a little longer, they all made records. The evidence is right there. It's right in front of us. So you have to ignore historical reality. You have to turn your back on authenticity and on idiomatic expression in order to perpetrate these abominations on the music of Brahms. And that happens all the time these days. That could not have happened in the first half of the 20th century. It just could have, because the people who were there. They just would have said, stop it. It's ridiculous. What are you doing? But we have very short memories. And we have the ability to change our perspective, on a dime when it's necessary. And so I wouldn't say that great Brahms is impossible these days, but you're much less likely to encounter it. You're much more likely to encounter all kinds of other wackadoo options and ideas and philosophies and some of them are fun. And I can't say that Brahms's music isn't strong enough to withstand these onslaughts. Sometimes it may benefit from it. You have to take each performance as it comes. But within the pool of Brahms conducting, the idea that we're going to hear idiomatic and traditional, if you want to call it that, Brahms' performances they are dying out. They are becoming less prominent. Some may think that's a good thing. Some may think, okay, we have enough time to move on to something else. But the problem is that, of course, people are still under just as much pressure to play Brahms as they always were. And so there's tons and tons and tons of it still coming. And so much of it is just absolutely wretched because it has to be compared. It has to be. It must be compared to the great Brahms performances of the past, to the ones that have the provenance. And that's a much taller order. It's going to take a conductor of real vision and genius and musicality and common sense and moral decency to still create great Brahms and get away with it. And that those people are going to be fewer and further between than they have been in times past. Now, this is not for me a reason for pessimism. I'm just making note of it as a historical phenomenon because I think that it first of all, it gives me something to do, and I hear horrible recordings of things, which I always like. But it also allows us to continually look at this stuff afresh and determine ultimately what the most viable parameters of excellence and valid idiomatic interpretation are. I mean, you find it in contrast to that horror show or that disaster. And so, it's not a bad thing necessarily. It is a sort of, a pointlessly annoying thing in places when it happens, but there's still room. There will always be room for great Brahms recordings and great Brahms performances, and there are great Brahms cycles which post-date the turn of the 21st century, and we will be talking about them in other videos. But this is a genuine historical moment. I think we're in it. I think we can see it happening. And I just think it's fascinating. It really is. I mean, we have to take a step back and take a step back from our own preferences. I just like this because it's new, or I like this because it's old, or I like this because it's this, and just look at the whole picture and see where it's going and what's been happening. And we find today there are splendid Brahms conductors out there. Manfred Honeck does great Brahms. And actually, staying in Pittsburgh, Marek Janowski did a terrific Brahms cycle, for example. I mean, they're out there. They can happen. They can happen any time. And every so often, you never know, there may be some kid who wants to be a conductor who has a real feeling for Brahms. Because after all, the lessons in how to perform it aren't a mystery. We have the recordings and we have the scores themselves, which are really pretty specific. Brahms was nothing if not obsessively, detail-oriented. And we know what the overall parameters are. It's not a mystery. It's only a mystery to the conductors who think that they want to do some sort of, regie theater, one of those crazy directorial opera things where, they just dissect or deconstruct the music and whatnot. And we'll always have people who do that. That's a thing, and it's a big thing today. But I suspect its moment will pass eventually. I actually think it's kind of passing now in some respects. I think with the return to tonality and all of that stuff, we're all going to start digesting the lessons of the past, few decades, and out of it will come some fresh understanding of what makes sense and how well the music should and could be played, and we'll be here to enjoy it. So that's my thinking, and I really think Brahms is a wonderful subject to look at the history of evolving aesthetics and performance practice over the 20th century and into the 21st. And it's going to be very, very interesting to continue to hear what people do and see how it sounds, or hear how it sounds, and compare it to what we know to have been a version of tradition, a version of authenticity, and judge whether or not it measures up. That's why we keep on listening. So thank you so much for joining me. Take care.